You married above your station, little nurse. Your parents still smell like grease and old coffee. Don't ever forget where you came from. My mother-in-law said it loud enough for 200 guests to hear, then slapped me hard enough to turn my head. The band stopped. Champagne spilled across my dress. Her family laughed like it was the best toast of the night. My husband stepped between us in 1 second. "Touch my wife again," he said, voice low, "and we're done." Beatrice only smirked. She was still smiling when the quiet man sitting directly behind him put both hands on the table and forced himself to his feet. It took him longer than most men. The room went dead silent. By the time that night ended, Beatrice no longer owned the room, the guests, or her own son's respect. My name is Matilda Miller. I'm 31 years old. Before I tell you what happened next, take a second to like and subscribe, but only if this story earns it. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I like knowing who's listening. To understand why that man stood up, you have to understand a chair. My parents own a diner off Lejeune Boulevard in Jacksonville, North Carolina. It's called Miller's. My father has run it for 22 years, and in 22 years, he has kept one rule that never bent. Nobody eats alone in his diner. If a man comes in and sits by himself with that look, the look of somebody who has nowhere to be, my father brings him coffee he didn't order and stands there until the man talks. Marines, mostly. We're a marine town. You learn to read the ones who are carrying something. Sunday nights, the diner closes to the public and opens to us. My mother cooks too much food, the way she always has, and the family eats at the long table by the window. And at that table, for years, there was a chair nobody sat in. "Set his place anyway," my mother would say. Every Sunday he wasn't there. Fork on the left, knife on the right, glass turned up. An empty chair with a full setting in front of it. How wasn't blood? He was somebody the world had thrown away, and my parents picked back up. I'll get to him. For now, know that the chair was never a sad thing in our house. It was a promise. It meant a seat was being kept, that the door hadn't closed, that when he came home there would be a place already waiting, and he wouldn't have to ask for it. I grew up on that. On the idea that you measure a family by who it makes room for. I want you to see a Sunday, so the rest of this makes sense. The last customer's gone by 4, my father flipping the sign and locking the door, then unlocking his own quiet the way he does, rolling his shoulders once like he's setting something down. My mother at the flat top with 3 pans going, telling everyone to sit even though nothing's ready, because sitting is the point, and the food is just the excuse. My brother and his kids. A regular or two who has nowhere else. The windows going gold, then blue. And that one chair, set and empty, the fork squared to the edge of the table the way my mother squares everything, because a thing worth keeping is worth keeping properly. Nobody explained the chair to me when I was young. It was just there, the way a scar is just there, a piece of the family's body. When I was old enough to ask, my mother said only, "It's for whoever needs it," and went back to the stove, and I understood that the answer was the whole philosophy of the house folded into 5 words. You keep a place. You don't ask the person to deserve it first. You set the fork and you wait. I carried that into my work without meaning to. I remember a man early in my career, a stroke patient, furious at his own left hand, who told me on his worst day that he was done, that he wanted to be left alone, that there was no point. I didn't argue with him. I pulled a chair up next to his bed and I sat down and I stayed, and after a while he started to cry, and after a longer while he picked the fork back up, a real fork. We were working on feeding himself, and he got a bite of food to his mouth on his own for the first time in a month, and neither of us said anything about it, because some victories are too big to congratulate. That's the job. You don't fix people. You keep a place next to them until they can stand in it themselves. I was good at that for strangers. I could sit with anyone's despair. What I couldn't do, for the longest time, was hear an insult aimed at me and treat it as an insult. I'd hear it and immediately begin the work of understanding the person who'd said it, as if my own hurt were a patient to be managed and theirs were the only real feeling in the room. I became a nurse because of it, I think. Rehab nursing, specifically. For 8 years now, I've worked with people learning to use their bodies again after those bodies failed them. Strokes, amputations, spinal injuries. A lot of my patients are service members. I'm good at my job. I'm good at handing a person back their dignity a half inch at a time, at standing next to someone on the parallel bars and not letting my face show anything but certainty, even when I'm not certain at all. I'm slower, it turns out, at protecting my own dignity. That's the part of this story I'm least proud of, so I'll tell you now instead of pretending. For a long time, when someone treated me badly, my first instinct was to explain them to myself. She's tired, he's stressed, they didn't mean it that way. I could give a stranger their whole life back, and I couldn't give myself a single boundary. There's a coin I keep. Brass, worn smooth on one edge, heavy for its size. A patient pressed it into my hand once, folded my fingers over it, and told me to keep it. I carried it in the pocket of my scrubs for years. I'll tell you what it cost him to give it to me. Not yet. That's where I started. A diner, a chair, a coin, and a habit of making excuses for people who never made any for me. Then I met Desmond. He walked into Miller's on a Tuesday in October, still in his flight suit, and he sat at the counter and ordered the meatloaf, which is what you order if you actually want to eat, and not just be seen ordering something. He tipped like a man who had waited tables once in his life, and when he got up to leave, he pushed his stool in and stacked his own plate at the end of the counter without being asked. That told me more than any uniform could have. He flew Ospreys out of New River. Captain Desmond Holloway. He came back the next Tuesday, and the one after that, and eventually he stopped pretending it was about the meatloaf. I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to make him sound perfect, and he wasn't. But he was kind in the specific, unshowy way I trust. He remembered things. He asked my mother about her knee. He looked at the wall of Sunday photos once, for a while, the way you look at other people's family pictures when you're a little hungry for the thing they show. And then he moved on, because he had no reason to study a stranger's family. He didn't recognize anyone. I know that now. At the time, it meant nothing. It was just a man being polite about photographs. Our first real date, he took me to a place with cloth napkins and a wine list, and I could tell within 10 minutes that he'd chosen it because he thought it was what you were supposed to do, and that neither of us was comfortable in it. Halfway through, I put down my menu and said I'd rather have a hot dog on the waterfront, and something in his whole body loosened, like I'd let him out of a room. We ate hot dogs on a bench and watched the container ships come up the Cape Fear, and he told me about flying, the real version, not the recruiting poster version. The fear of it, the responsibility of carrying other people's sons in the back of your aircraft, the way you learn to keep your voice flat on the radio when everything in you wants to shake. I've trusted men who could admit fear ever since I was old enough to notice which ones couldn't. He met my parents on a Sunday, which I hadn't planned. He just showed up at the diner because I'd mentioned it, and my father put a plate in front of him without asking and watched him eat. That's my father's whole interview process. You can learn everything about a man from how he treats a plate of food he didn't order and a waitress who isn't watching. Desmond ate every bite, said thank you twice, and got up to help my mother carry dishes to the back, and my father caught my eye across the room and gave me a nod so small you'd have missed it if you weren't his daughter. That nod was worth more to me than the wine list. His own family was a different kind of test, and he'd been failing it his whole life without knowing the rules had been rigged. He told me once, quietly, that as a boy he'd learned to read his mother's mood by the seating at dinner, who was placed near her, who was placed far, who had been moved down for some infraction nobody would name. Love in that house was a chair that could be moved. You behaved, and you sat close. You disappointed her, and you found yourself, without explanation, at the end of the table. He'd spent 30 years trying to sit close. I think part of why he loved me was that at my parents' table there was no far end. There was just the table, and everyone at it. I deployed once while we were together, 7 months, and I learned during those 7 months what kind of man he was when I couldn't see him. He wrote real letters, not just texts, actual letters, in handwriting that got worse the more tired he was. About small things, the coffee, the heat, a bird that kept landing on the same piece of equipment every morning. He never once made me feel like an afterthought to the mission. And when he came home, thinner and quieter, the first place he wanted to go wasn't anywhere impressive. It was the diner. He wanted meatloaf and my mother's fussing, and to sit at the long table and be nobody special for an evening. I watched him let his shoulders down in that room and I thought, This is a man who knows the difference between a house that photographs well and a home you can breathe in. He proposed on the waterfront, near the bench where we'd eaten hot dogs, with no crowd and no photographer, and a ring he'd clearly agonized over that was exactly, perfectly plain. He said he'd almost done it somewhere grander, and then realized that grander was his mother's language, not ours. I said yes before he finished the sentence. Neither of us knew yet how much that plainness would come to mean, or how hard someone would work to make me feel it wasn't enough. There was one thing he wouldn't talk about. There was one thing he wouldn't talk about. Early on, maybe our third or fourth real conversation, he told me he flew with a guy they called Brick. He said it the way you say a name that still has a wound attached to it. I owe him everything, he said, and I let him disappear. Then he changed the subject so fast that I let him, because I know that face. I see it at work. You don't chase a person into a room they've closed the door on. To me, Brick was just a call sign, a word. I had no way in the world to connect it to anyone because the man I'm about to tell you about never once, in all the years I knew him, told me the truth about how he got hurt. He called it an accident. That was all. An accident. So there was no name on my side to match to Desmond's, and there was no story on Desmond's side except a call sign and a silence. Two people can love each other for a year and a half and still be standing on opposite sides of the same secret, each holding one half, neither one knowing there's a matching piece in the other's hand. Desmond told me about his family the way you'd warn someone about a step that isn't level. In my mother's house, he said one night. Love came with a seating chart. Yours doesn't. That's why I'm here. He laughed when he said it, but he wasn't joking. You'll meet her soon. Just don't let her decide who you are. I told him I could handle a difficult mother. I'd handled worse. I was wrong about which part would be hard. The Holloways live in Wilmington, about an hour down the coast, in a house that has a name and a history and a portrait of somebody's grandfather over the fireplace. Beatrice met us at the door in pearls, and she was gracious the way a closed gate is gracious. She took both my hands. She looked at them, my hands, which are a working person's hands, and she smiled. How wonderful, she said, to do work with your hands. We so admire that. I said thank you. I meant it even. It took me the whole dinner to understand that she had introduced me to her guests 3 separate times as the nurse Desmond's been seeing, and not once by my name. My place card at the table said Desmond's guest. Not Matilda. Guest. I told myself she was nervous. I actually thought that. She's nervous, meeting the woman her son loves. I gave her that, the way I give everyone that. After dinner, she walked me through the front rooms like a museum docent, showing me the framed photographs of the family's good works. Beatrice on a stage with a ribbon and enormous scissors. Beatrice at a gala under a banner that read "Honoring Those Who Serve." We've given so much to our military families, she said, and I stood there in a house that had given money to a banner while, an hour up the road, my parents had given a man a chair. There was a curio cabinet in the hall. On one of the shelves, propped up like a decorative object between a porcelain bird and a silver dish, was a military challenge coin. I don't know whose. I don't think Beatrice knew whose. It was just a nice brass thing that photographed well. I stopped in front of it a second too long, and I couldn't have told you then why it made my throat tight. I know now. The last thing that happened that night was the invitation. Beatrice had helped with the wedding invitations. She sent a proof to Desmond and copied me as a courtesy. I opened it in the car on the drive home, and the raised, expensive lettering read, Captain Desmond Holloway requests the honor of your presence, and then a name for his mother, and a name for his late grandfather being honored, and, where the bride's name should have been, nothing. A blank. Guest. A draft, Desmond said when I showed him, and his jaw tightened. We'll fix it. She'll fix it, I said. She never fixed it. He told me he'd handle it. I believed him, because I wanted to, and because handling it later is so much easier than handling it now. That was the first time he told me he'd take care of something with his mother. It would not be the last, and the gap between the promise and the doing is a big part of what this whole story turned on. I want you to notice something, because I didn't notice it for a long time. Nothing Beatrice did that night was something you could point to. A forgotten name is not a crime. A blank on a proof is a clerical thing. We admire people who work with their hands, is a compliment, if you squint. Each piece was deniable. That was the design. She was not a woman who lost control. She was a woman who never had to raise her voice, because everyone around her had spent a lifetime learning to lower theirs. I spent the drive home explaining her to myself. I'm telling you that so you understand. I didn't walk into this clear-eyed. I walked in the way most of us do, making room, giving the benefit of the doubt, keeping the peace, and calling it grace. It didn't stop at one dinner. That's the thing about a pattern. You can't see it in a single point. You need 3 or 4 before the line shows up. There was the dress. Beatrice insisted on coming to the fitting, which I let happen because refusing seemed dramatic. She sat in the corner of the boutique with a glass of something and watched me on the pedestal in the first gown, the one I loved, the one that made me feel like the best version of myself. And she tilted her head and said, "It's lovely. Maybe a little ambitious for your frame." Ambitious. She had a gift for words that left no fingerprints. The seamstress caught my eye in the mirror and said nothing, which was its own small kindness. I bought a different dress that day. I told myself I'd simply changed my mind. I hadn't. She'd changed it for me, and made me believe I'd done it myself. There was the lunch, just the 2 of us, which she framed as a chance to get to know each other and used as an interview. I kept failing. She asked what my parents did, and when I said they ran a diner, she repeated the word diner back to me softly, the way you repeat a diagnosis. She asked where I'd gone to school, and when I told her, she said, "Oh, a practical choice," which is what you say when you mean it isn't the right one. Every question was a door she opened just to show me it led somewhere I hadn't been. And I answered everyone, politely, and drove home replaying the lunch and finding new ways to have been more impressive. And there was the thing she said about the diner itself, which I didn't tell Desmond because it would have hurt him to know I'd heard it. She was on the phone with someone, in the next room, and she didn't know I was close, and she said, No, she's a nurse. The family has some little restaurant. It's fine. Desmond will settle down and it'll all get smoothed over." Smoothed over. Like I was a wrinkle. Like my whole life was a thing that would iron out once he came to his senses. I heard that, and I still went back for the next lunch. That's the part I need you to sit with, because it's the truest part. Knowing a person thinks of you as a wrinkle, and going back anyway, because the alternative, naming it, refusing it, felt like the thing that would break everything. I told myself I was being the bigger person. I was being a smaller one. There's a difference, and it took me far too long to learn it. The engagement was easy. It was the wedding that Beatrice went to work on. It started with the venue. Desmond and I had found a place we loved, a restored waterfront building in Wilmington, with brick walls and bad plumbing, and a view of the river that made you forgive the plumbing. We put down a deposit. 3 weeks later, Beatrice called to tell me she'd moved the wedding to her country club. "You'll thank me," she said. "The other place is charming, but it isn't quite us." I said we'd already paid the deposit. There was a small pause, the kind she used like punctuation, and she told me it had been handled. She had called and canceled it herself. She said it the way you'd mention watering a plant. I sat with that receipt for a long time. The cancellation notice. Our deposit gone. A decision made about my wedding without me in the room. I didn't fight it. I told myself the club was nicer. It was nicer. That's how it works. She never took anything that wasn't, on paper, an upgrade. She just took it without asking, and the taking was the point. Then I saw the guest list. Near the top, under honored guests, was a name I didn't know. Poppy Ashworth. When I asked Desmond, he went still in a way I was learning to read. "Poppy's family funds half my mother's league," he said. "Our mothers had ideas once, a long time ago." He looked at me. "I never had the idea. I want you to know that." I believed him. But I noticed Beatrice had seated Poppy at the front table, next to the family, in the chair that in a different version of this wedding might have been meant for a different bride. And I noticed that Desmond didn't know his mother had invited her at all. I filed it away. I didn't tell him. I keep coming back to that. All the small things I decided to carry quietly, instead of setting down where he could see them. "Poppy's family has been so good to the league," Beatrice sighed to me one afternoon, as though I were something that had happened to her. As though I'd walked into her life and taken something off a shelf that was already promised. The venue was only the beginning. Once she had the ground, she took the rest of it, room by room. She changed the menu. We'd wanted something simple, food people would actually eat. My mother had even offered to cater the dessert, which, I understand now, was the whole reason Beatrice replaced the entire menu with a plated dinner from the club's kitchen. She wasn't going to have Miller's pie at a Holloway wedding. She said the club had requirements. She said it the way you say a rule that protects everyone from something embarrassing. She had opinions about the vows. When she learned Desmond and I were writing our own, she suggested gently that it might be more appropriate to use the traditional ones, that personal vows could come across as, and here she paused for the word, informal. She meant common. She meant the kind of thing people like my family do. Desmond kept ours anyway, one of the few fights he won, and I should have noticed how much it cost him to win even that. Because here was the pattern, the real one, the one I kept excusing. Every time his mother took something, Desmond would find me afterward and say, "I'll handle it." And he meant it. He wasn't lying. But handling it always seemed to mean a conversation that happened later, or didn't happen, or happened and changed nothing. Because he'd been raised inside her weather and didn't fully know there was any other kind. He loved me. He also flinched from her the way you flinch from a thing that hurt you before you were old enough to have words for it. Both were true. I spent our whole engagement telling myself only the first one mattered. "I'll talk to her," he'd say, about the venue, the menu, the dress, the name left off the invitation. And I'd say okay, and nothing would move. And I'd add it to the pile of things I was carrying quietly, telling myself that after the wedding, once we were married, once she'd accepted it was real, she'd soften. That's the lie I told myself most often. She'll soften. The seating chart was where it stopped being deniable, at least to me. Beatrice put my parents at the farthest table from the head table, back by the doors to the kitchen, table 22, the last one, where the servers came and went, and the swinging door let out a draft every time it opened. When my mother saw it, she didn't say anything. Beatrice patted her hand. "The back is so much cozier," Beatrice told her. "You'll be able to slip out early if it's all too much." My mother is not a woman who needs to slip out of anything. She raised 3 kids and buried her own parents and ran a kitchen at 5 in the morning for 22 years. But she just smiled and said, "That's kind of you." And to me, later in the parking lot, when I was shaking with a fury I didn't have the practice to use, she said one word, "Let her." I thought my mother was choosing peace. I thought she was doing the same thing I did, folding herself smaller to keep the day from breaking. I understand now that she was doing something completely different. She was so calm because she already knew something I didn't. She had known for months. But I'm getting ahead of the chair again. The last thing Beatrice did before the wedding was the seat. My parents had asked for one extra chair. Not a table, not a fuss. One seat, for a friend of the family who was trying to make it back in time. They asked quietly, through me, the way you ask for a small thing you expect to be given. Beatrice erased it. "We're simply at capacity," she said. And I watched her draw a red line through the chair on the master chart, one clean stroke, and move on to the flowers. At capacity. 200 people, and no room for one man in a folding chair. My father was standing next to me when she did it. He didn't argue. He just reached over, took the chart, refolded it along its creases, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "We'll see about that," he said, mild as anything, and went back to the flowers. I thought he was letting it go. He wasn't. My father almost never argues, and it took me years to understand that this is not the same as surrender. Some people go quiet because they've given up. My father goes quiet because he's decided, and once he's decided, there's nothing left to say. I want to describe the morning of the wedding, because it's where the last calm hour of my old life lived, and because of the coin. My mother came into the room where I was getting dressed, holding a needle and thread, and she asked me for the coin. I'd told her once that I wanted to carry it. Something borrowed, something brave. She had me stand still, and she folded the hem of my dress back and stitched the brass coin into it, low, where it would sit against my ankle, hidden under the layers. "So you carry someone brave with you," she said, and bit the thread with her teeth the way she does, and smoothed the fabric down over it. My father came in a little later to walk me down. He'd rented a suit, and he kept touching the collar of it like it belonged to another man. He looked at me for a long moment, and I braced for him to say something big, because it was that kind of day. He didn't. My father almost never says the big thing. You look like your grandmother, he said finally. She never let anybody tell her she was small either. He offered me his arm. Whatever happens today, you've already got a place at my table. That's not something a wedding can give you or take away. You remember that. I thought it was just a father being sentimental. I know now he chose those words on purpose, the way he chooses all his words, few and exact. I was reminding me of the one thing I was about to need most. A place at the table. Something no one gets to give you or take away. I want to be honest about the wedding itself, the ceremony part, because it was good. That's the thing people forget when a day goes wrong at the end. The ceremony was beautiful. Desmond's hands were shaking when he took mine. He said his vows like he was afraid of dropping them. He'd fought his mother to keep them, and now that he had them, he could barely get them out. He said that he had grown up believing love was something you earned and could lose, a seat that could be moved, and that I had shown him a table where no one gets moved down. He said he wanted to spend his life learning how to love like that. His voice cracked on learning, and he stopped and started again. And I stood there with a coin against my ankle and thought that whatever else this day did, it had already given me this. When the officiant said husband and wife, my father made a sound in the second row that he tried to turn into a cough. My mother didn't try to hide anything. She just let the tears run and gripped my father's hand. Even Caleb, though I didn't know yet that the quiet man near the back was Caleb, or that he had known for 3 months exactly what he was watching. Even he, I'd learn later, had to look at the floor for a moment. The people who loved me were all in that room, and for the length of a ceremony I had everything, and I didn't know how few minutes were left in the having. For about an hour, I was so happy I forgot to keep watch. That was my mistake. I stopped watching. The reception was in the club ballroom, all chandeliers and river through the tall windows. The unease came back the moment we walked in, and I wish I'd trusted it. I found my parents at their table by the kitchen doors, and my father had taken off his jacket and hung it on the back of his chair, and every time a server came through the swinging door, a little draft lifted the tablecloth. My mother had a plate of food she wasn't eating. They looked, at the worst table in the room, entirely at peace. And I read that peace as resignation, and it wasn't. I keep telling you that because I keep needing to have understood it, even now. Beatrice moved through the room like weather. A hand on this shoulder, a laugh at that table, a word in the ear of a man whose name I'd been told mattered. She was in her element, the queen of a court she'd assembled, and I watched her cross toward a knot of her most important guests, and gesture, twice, toward an empty chair near the front, the honored place, as if she were saving it for someone who hadn't arrived yet. I didn't know then who she thought she was saving it for. I know now it was the shape of the wedding she'd wanted, the one with a different bride in it, and she couldn't help gesturing at the space where that version should have stood. I should have felt like the bride. Instead, I felt like a guest at a party thrown to prove a point, and the point was that I didn't belong at it. Beatrice had a champagne toast planned, and she took the microphone herself before anyone else could. And she raised her glass and looked out at 200 people who did what she wanted because they always had. To Desmond, she said, who could have married anyone, and who chose someone so... A small, warm pause, a smile for the room, so refreshingly simple. A ripple of laughter from the Holloway tables. Not everyone, but enough. Refreshingly simple. I stood there in my dress with a coin against my ankle and smiled, because that is what I had trained myself to do. And across the room I saw Desmond's hand close hard around the stem of his glass. I didn't see the man come in. There was some small movement near the back, near the head table, a guest arriving late and an usher going to help. I caught only the edge of it. A man on crutches, apologizing quietly, and the usher glancing down at the crutches and then, instead of walking him all the way across the ballroom to some far seat, simply putting him in the closest open chair, the one right behind the groom's table, the nearest place, the accessible one. I remember thinking distantly that it was kind of the usher. I didn't look at his face. Beatrice had my elbow. She was steering me toward the family for photographs, and I was watching her, not him. From the far side of the room, my mother lifted her hand and gave the smallest nod to the man in that chair, a nod like a door opening. But Beatrice turned me away before I could follow it, and the moment closed, and I lost my one chance to understand what was about to happen before it happened to me. The photographs were where it happened. The photographer was arranging the family for the formal portrait, the one that goes on the wall and outlives everyone in it. Beatrice was positioning people with little touches, a hand on a shoulder, a nudge, and there was a gap, a space left open near Desmond, at the center, where the frame had been composed around someone who wasn't standing in it. I moved to fill it, because I was the bride, and it was my place. Beatrice's hand came down on my arm. "This photograph," she said, pleasant, clear, "is for family." I didn't move. That was new. A year of practice at making myself smaller, and for once my feet just stayed where they were. I think that surprised her more than anything I could have said. She was used to me stepping back. I didn't step back, and that's when she did it. "You married above your station, little nurse." Her voice carried. She made it carry. "Your parents still smell like grease and old coffee. Don't ever forget where you came from." Then she slapped me. It wasn't a tap. It turned my head. My earring came loose and swung against my jaw. Someone had handed me a fresh glass of champagne a moment before, and it tipped when I flinched, and cold wine went down the front of my dress in a dark, spreading line. The band, mid-song, dropped out one instrument at a time until there was nothing, and the Holloway tables laughed. Not gasps, laughter. Like she'd landed the best line of the night. Like watching a woman get struck across the face at her own wedding was a bit of theater put on for their benefit, the help getting what the help gets. I want to tell you I did something magnificent. I didn't. I stood there with wine on my dress and my hand not quite at my cheek, and I felt, for about 3 seconds, more alone than I have ever felt in a room full of people. 200 witnesses, and the loudest thing in the world was that laughter. I looked for my parents. My father was in his seat at the far table. He did not stand up. My mother had her hands folded in her lap, calm as a Sunday morning. And my father was looking, deliberately, steadily, not at me, and not at Beatrice, but at the man seated in the chair directly behind my husband. I didn't understand the look. I filed it with everything else I didn't understand yet, and I set my glass down on the nearest table because my hand had started to shake, and I didn't want anyone to see it. Then Desmond moved. He crossed the floor in 1 second and put himself between his mother and me, his back to 200 people, facing her. I couldn't see his face from where I stood. I could see hers, and I watched it change as she looked up at her son. "Mom." Just that at first. A warning shaped like a name. Over her shoulder, I saw his eyes drop to the front table, to the place card sitting there in Beatrice's careful hand. Poppy Ashworth. He saw it. I watched him see it, watched him understand in real time exactly what his mother had planned, and who she'd planned it with. And something in his shoulders went very still. "Touch my wife again," he said, and his voice dropped so low that the whole room leaned in to catch it. "And we're done." Done. The word landed like a dropped plate on a tile floor. His family had been laughing 5 seconds earlier. Nobody was laughing now. Beatrice smiled anyway. That's the part I keep coming back to. He had just told her, in front of everyone she'd spent her life impressing, that he would choose me over her, and she smiled, because she was certain. She'd spent 34 years being right about her son. He always came back. He always chose the peace of her approval over the cost of standing against her. Why would today be different? "Don't be dramatic, darling," she said, and reached up to pat his cheek, unhurried, still smiling. "She'll learn her place, or she'll leave." I'm going to pause the story right here, at the worst second of it, because I need to ask you something. He'd just said we're done to his own mother, out loud, in front of everyone. If that were you, if that were your family, could you have said it? Could you have said it and meant it, knowing what it would cost? Tell me in the comments before you hear the rest. I want to know who I'm talking to, because here is where the room stopped being hers. Behind my husband, the man in the chair the usher had given him put both hands flat on the table, and he began, slowly, to stand. It took him longer than it takes most men. There was a hitch to it, a lean, one leg carrying weight the other couldn't. His crutches were propped against the chair, and he didn't reach for them. He pushed himself up on his hands, on the table, on whatever was in front of him, and rose to his full height, and one trouser leg hung and moved differently than the other. Around the room, in ones and twos, men I hadn't marked as anything in particular were turning to look at him. Marines. You can tell, even out of uniform, the way they came alert. A few of them had that expression you get when you see someone you were sure you'd never see again. At one of the tables, a man in his 50s, a retired officer by his bearing, half rose from his seat before he'd even decided to, one hand flat on the table, staring. Two younger men near the bar went still and straight, the way you go still when someone walks into a room whose name you've only ever said with respect. I didn't understand any of it. All I knew was that a stranger on crutches had gotten to his feet, and the whole room had turned toward him like iron filings toward a magnet, and something enormous was arriving that I had no name for yet. The quiet had a texture now. It wasn't the shocked quiet after the slap. It was the quiet of a room realizing, collectively, a beat ahead of me, that it had gotten the entire evening wrong. Beatrice's smile slipped. I found out later she recognized him before Desmond did, before I did. She recognized him because she had spent 3 years trying to get this man to one of her galas. This exact man, this quiet, difficult, respected man that everyone in her circle wanted a photograph with, and he had turned her down every single time. She had a blank space on her wall where a picture with him should have been. And now here he was, standing up at a wedding she'd built to honor her family's name. And he was not looking at her the way people looked at her. He was looking at me. Desmond turned to follow the silence to its source. He turned, and he saw the man's face, and I watched my husband, my steady, disciplined husband, who flies aircraft in the dark and doesn't flinch. I watched his voice break on a single syllable. Brick? The man behind him didn't answer Desmond. Not yet. His eyes found the hem of my dress where the coin was, as if he could see through the fabric to the brass against my ankle, as if he already knew it was there. Then he looked at Beatrice and he spoke, and his voice was even and quiet, and it filled the entire room. Ma'am, he said, you have no idea whose family you just insulted. And I looked at my mother and my father, sitting at the worst table in the room, and neither of them looked surprised. Not surprised at all. His name is Caleb Brennan. In the squadron they called him Brick, because he was the man you could not move. He flew with Desmond for years. And I want to tell you what he told that room, because he told it plainly, without heat, the way you tell a truth you've made peace with. I flew ospreys with your son, he said to Beatrice. But he said it to the room, because the room was listening now, and she was only part of it. 4 years ago, on a night training flight, we had an emergency. His aircraft was in trouble, and mine was the one that could stay with him. So I stayed with him. He paused. We got him down. I didn't come out of it as clean. He reached down and knocked once, with his knuckles, against his left leg. There was a sound, a hard, hollow knock, brass on something that wasn't bone. The Corps gave me a medal for that night, Caleb said. My own family gave me a forwarding address. Nobody laughed now. When I got hurt, he went on, the people who raised me decided I was a complication. Wheelchairs don't photograph well. A son who needs help getting up the stairs isn't the son they'd planned on. He let that sit. So I spent about 8 months learning how much a person can be worth to a family before he becomes an inconvenience. And then a door opened that I did not expect. He looked at the far table, at my parents. The only door that opened for me after that, he said, was a diner. I heard my mother breathe in. I saw my father's jaw work. You want to know her station? Caleb said. And now, finally, he looked at me, and his voice did something it hadn't done yet. It thickened, just slightly, just enough. This woman, the one you just hit, she was the nurse who taught me how to walk on this leg. 8 months, 5 days a week, she stood next to me while I fell down and got me back up, and she never once let me quit, and she never once made me feel like less of a man for needing her. He turned back to Beatrice. And her parents, the ones who smell like grease and old coffee. They gave me a chair at their table and told me I was family. They kept a place set for me every Sunday for 4 years. Every Sunday, whether I could make it or not. He reached into his jacket and took out a photograph, worn soft at the corners from being carried. He didn't pass it around. He just held it up, briefly, and I knew what it was without seeing it clearly, because I'd been in 100 of them. A Sunday at Miller's, the long table, and a chair that wasn't empty, because he was in it. You spent tonight, Caleb said to Beatrice, trying to teach her where she came from. I came here to tell everyone in this room exactly where she came from. She came from the only people who didn't leave. Desmond made a sound. I turned, and my husband was staring at Caleb, and then at me, and the pieces were landing on him all at once. 4 years of guilt rearranging themselves into something he could barely hold. "You never told me it was you," he said to me. Not an accusation, something closer to awe. "All this time, it was you." I hadn't told him. I hadn't told anyone. It wasn't mine to tell. Caleb had called it an accident for 4 years, and I had kept his privacy the way you keep a patient's privacy, out of habit and respect. And so I had never once said the words "the nurse who put Brick back together," because to me he wasn't Brick. He was just Caleb. Our Caleb. The chair. The room chose then. And I want to be careful about how I tell you this, because it did not happen the way it happens in the stories where everyone claps. Nobody clapped. What happened was quieter, and worse for Beatrice, and I've thought about it a lot since. The Marines stood first. Not all at once, not on cue, just a slow rising around the room as the men who understood what Caleb had done got to their feet, because that is what they do when a debt like that is standing in the room. Then a woman at one of the Holloway tables, one of the ones who had laughed, set her fork down very carefully and did not pick it up again, and looked at her plate. Then an older man in an expensive suit, a name I'd learn, one of the people Beatrice most wanted to matter to, pushed his chair back, buttoned his jacket, said something low to his wife, and walked out. Not angry, just done. He simply withdrew, the way you withdraw from something you no longer want your name near. And Poppy Ashworth, at the front table, in the chair that had been meant to mean something, stood up quietly, gathered her clutch, and left before anyone had to look at her. It kept happening, in that low, terrible, undramatic way. A couple 2 tables over rose and went to find their coats. A woman I recognized from the League photographs on Beatrice's wall, a woman who had, minutes earlier, laughed, got up and crossed the whole ballroom, past everyone, and stood next to my mother at the worst table in the room, and said something to her I couldn't hear, and stayed there. One of Desmond's young lieutenants walked over and, without a word, picked up the crutches from beside Caleb's chair and set them within his reach, in case he wanted them, and then stood at his shoulder like an honor guard who hadn't been ordered to anything and didn't need to be. Nobody shouted. Nobody made a speech. That was the unbearable part for Beatrice, I think. There was no fight for her to win, because no one was fighting. They were simply, one by one, reassigning themselves to a different part of the room, and every reassignment was a sentence she couldn't appeal. Beatrice turned to find her husband, Gerald. He had been sitting through all of it, silent, the way he was always silent. She looked at him for help, for a partner, for someone to restore the order of the room to what it had always been. Gerald looked down at the table. Then he looked away, toward the windows, toward the river. He didn't stand and he didn't speak, but he didn't meet her eyes. And for Beatrice that was its own kind of falling. She was losing the room, and there was nothing to fight, because nobody was fighting her. They were just, one by one, ceasing to be her audience. That's when I finally spoke. I'd been quiet the whole time. I hadn't planned a single word, and I found I didn't want to say much. "You spent a year deciding I was beneath you," I said to her. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "You just never asked who I'd carried. That was all. I didn't raise it. I didn't list her sins. I put one true thing down next to another true thing, and let the room hold both. I reached down, and I felt for the coin through the hem of my dress, and then I took my husband's hand on one side, and Caleb's arm on the other, and the 3 of us walked away from the head table Beatrice had built, back across the whole length of that ballroom, to the worst table in the room, where my parents were, and we sat down with them. We left her standing in the middle of her own party, in her pearls, under the chandeliers, with no one waiting for her to tell them what to do next. If you'd have been in that room, if you'd have stood up when the Marines did, then you already know which table you'd have ended up at. There's more to this than the moment she lost the room. What it cost us came after. Stay with me. The party didn't end so much as empty out. Within half an hour, a third of the room was gone. Beatrice's third, the people she'd invited to be impressed. They collected their coats from the coat check with the particular quietness of people who have decided something and don't want to discuss it. One of them, a board member from the League, stopped by our table on her way out and said to Desmond, "Give your mother my regrets." She didn't choose that word by accident. Regrets is what you send when you're not coming, and it's what you send when something has died. The band, God bless them, started playing again. The people who were still there were the people who'd wanted to be there in the first place. Desmond's squadron, my father's regulars, the cousins who'd never cared about the seating chart. Somebody's uncle asked my mother to dance. The night impossibly kept going. It's a strange thing to have the worst moment of your life and the best moment of your life inside the same 45 minutes. My cheek still carried the heat of her hand while I danced my first dance with my husband under the same chandeliers she'd chosen. Caleb sat at our table with a plate of my mother's food in front of him. The club's kitchen had, at my mother's quiet insistence, let her bring one thing after all. And he ate it slowly, and he watched Desmond and me on the floor with an expression I couldn't read then and can read now. It was the face of a man watching two halves of his life, two people he'd loved in two separate rooms, finally standing in the same one. He'd carried that knowledge alone for 3 months, and now it was out. And he looked tired and lit up all at once, the way you look when you finally set down something heavy. The guests who mattered to Beatrice were gone. The people who mattered to me were dancing. I understood, somewhere in that hour, that those had been two different weddings all along, held in the same room, and that only one of them had survived the night, and it was mine. Beatrice left without another word to any of us. I don't know what time. I only know that at some point I looked up and she wasn't there, and neither was Gerald, and their absence didn't change the temperature of the room at all. That's the thing about a person who rules by everyone's agreement to be ruled. The second the agreement ends, so does the rule, and it turns out to have been made of nothing. Desmond and Caleb sat at that back table for a long time, the two of them, with the coin, my coin, Caleb's coin, the squadron's coin, sitting on the tablecloth between them, where I'd set it after my mother worked it loose from my hem. I looked for you, Desmond said. He'd said it before, I think, in his head, 1,000 times. After. I tried to find you. Your number was disconnected. Your family wouldn't. Not hard enough, Caleb said. But he was smiling when he said it, and he put his hand on the back of Desmond's neck, the way you do with a brother. And Desmond dropped his head, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Caleb looked over at me, and something crossed his face, some private thing he wasn't ready to hand over yet. There's something Matilda doesn't know, he said. Something I've known for a while now. He picked up the coin, turned it once in his fingers, set it back down. But not tonight. Tonight's not the night for it. I didn't push. I'd learned that much from him at least. You don't chase a man into a room he's not ready to open. I thought the hard part was over. I want to tell you that, because it's what I believed, sitting at that table with wine dried stiff on my dress and my whole family around me. I thought we'd survive the worst of it. The worst of it hadn't started. Here is what nobody tells you about the moment your husband chooses you over his family in front of 200 people. It feels like winning. And then the party ends, and you have to go home and live inside the cost of it. 2 weeks after the wedding, the calls stopped. Not dramatically. Beatrice didn't disown him. There was no letter, no scene. It was quieter than that, and quieter is worse. Desmond had grown up inside a machine of family. The standing dinners, the club, the network, the doors that opened because a Holloway was pushing on them. And one by one, without anyone announcing it, those doors stopped opening. An invitation that didn't come. A call that wasn't returned. A man his father knew, who used to take his call, who was suddenly always in a meeting. My mother didn't disown me, he told me one night, sitting on the edge of our bed with his elbows on his knees, turning his own coin over in his hands the way Caleb turned his. She just stopped setting a place for me. Neither of us missed the irony. His family's punishment was to take away his chair. Mine was to keep one set. I watched one of those doors close in real time, and it told me more than any of the ones that closed quietly. There was a man, a family friend, an old colleague of Gerald's, someone who'd known Desmond since he was a boy and had promised months before to make an introduction that mattered for the next stage of Desmond's career, a civilian position for when his flying days wound down. Desmond called to confirm it. I was in the room. I watched his face while the man on the other end explained, with enormous warmth, that the timing wasn't right after all, that things were complicated, that he was sure Desmond understood. Desmond said he understood. He thanked the man. He hung up, and he sat there with the phone in his hand, and he didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't say her name, Desmond finally said. Not once. He didn't have to. He set the phone face down. That's how it works. Nobody ever says the name. Things just get complicated, all at once, for everybody. I didn't have anything to fix it with, so I did the only thing I know how to do, which is the thing my mother taught me. I sat down next to him and I stayed. Work was the thing that kept me standing that month, and I want to tell you about one shift, because it put the whole mess in proportion. I had a patient, 19 years old, who'd lost most of the use of his legs and was fighting me on every single thing, the way the young ones do, because at 19 you can't yet tell the difference between accepting help and giving up. He snapped at me one morning that I couldn't possibly understand. And I thought about a slap at a wedding, and a name left off an invitation, and a man on the other end of a phone saying the timing wasn't right, and I thought, no, I can't understand your legs, but I understand a little about being told you're less than you are, and about deciding not to believe it. I didn't say any of that. I just stood next to him at the bars and told him to try once more, and he did, and he took 2 steps, and he cried, and I kept my face certain the way I always do. Standing next to somebody while they refuse to quit, that's the one thing I have never once doubted I was good for. It steadied me. It reminded me that whatever Beatrice thought my station was, it had never once been the thing that told me who I was. I watched it wear on him in ways he wouldn't say. He'd been raised to believe that a man's family was his standing, his root system, the thing that told the world who he was. And he'd cut himself loose from it for me, and now he was finding out what it feels like to float. He didn't regret it. I know he didn't. But not regretting a thing and not grieving it are different, and he was grieving, and I was the reason. That's when my old habit came back for me, right when I was most tired. I found myself one evening, with my phone in my hand, and a message half-typed to Beatrice. I'm sorry things went the way they did. Maybe we could... I got that far. I stood in the kitchen with my thumb over the send button, and every part of me that had spent a lifetime keeping the peace by folding smaller was telling me that if I just apologized, if I just took a little of the blame, the doors would open again, and Desmond could have his family back, and it would be my gift to him. Maybe if I just apologized to her, I started to say, out loud, to Desmond, who was in the doorway. No, he said. He didn't even let me finish. Not this time. He crossed the kitchen and took the phone out of my hand, gently, and deleted the message without reading the rest of it. I know what you do, he said. You give people their dignity back. You've been doing it your whole life, for strangers, for me, for Caleb. But you don't get to give her yours, that's the one you keep. I put the phone down. My mother said something to me around then too, when I told her I was thinking of reaching out to smooth things over, of finding some way back to peace. She was rolling out dough at the diner, and she didn't look up. Peace isn't the same as quiet, Matilda, she said. You've been confusing those your whole life. Quiet is what she wanted from you. Peace is what you have now, and it cost you something, and that's how you know it's real. The deepest cut came later from Desmond in the dark, when he couldn't sleep. For 3 years I thought I failed him, he said. I knew he meant Caleb. I thought I was the guy who let his wingman disappear, the guy who got saved and then couldn't even hold on to the man who saved him. He was quiet a moment. And it turns out your parents did the thing I couldn't do. Your family caught him when I dropped him. I don't know whether to thank them or be ashamed in front of them for the rest of my life. I didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one. I just held on to him, and somewhere on the nightstand his phone lit up with a message, and he reached for it, and read it, and went still. It was from Caleb. Sunday, it said. Come to the diner. There's something you both should hear. Before that Sunday came, there was Beatrice to settle. She reached out first, which surprised me. A voicemail, formal, the kind of message you leave when you've decided the other person needs to be handled. She wanted to meet. She wanted, she said, to put this unpleasantness behind us, for Desmond's sake. We went. Both of us. Not because we owed her anything, but because Desmond wanted to say the thing to her face, and I think he'd earned the right to. She had coffee set out in the good room, the one with the grandfather over the fireplace. She started the way she always started, as though we were the ones who needed managing. Feelings ran high, she said. Things were said. I'm willing to move forward if we can all agree to be civil going forward. That's not an apology, Desmond said. I don't know what you want me to apologize for, darling. For caring about this family's name? I set my cup down. You hit me at my wedding, I said. In front of 200 people. You called my parents by the way they smell. I kept my voice level, because level was the only weapon that worked on her. I'm not here for an apology. I stopped needing one somewhere around Sunday. I'm here to tell you what it would cost to stay in our lives, so you can decide. She looked at me the way you look at furniture that started talking. Then she tried the thing that had always worked. She turned to Desmond, and her voice softened into the register she must have used on him since he was small, wounded, reasonable, warm. Sweetheart, I raised you. I gave you everything you have. Are you really going to throw your family away over a misunderstanding at a party? She let her eyes go bright. Family is family. You don't get another mother. It was expertly done. A year earlier, it might have worked on me, even sitting there. That pull to be reasonable, to be the one who bends so the room can untense. I felt the old instinct rise, the one that wanted to say something soothing, to take a little of the blame, to fix the discomfort by shrinking. I watched Desmond feel it too, watched 34 years of conditioning tighten around him. And then he looked at me, and he didn't shrink. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Mom, he said quietly. You knew exactly what you were doing. You always do. That's the whole problem. None of it was ever an accident. She sat back like she'd been touched by something cold. If you want to be in this marriage's life, I said, in our home, someday around our kids, you'll treat me as your son's wife, and you'll treat my parents as family, because they are. That's the price of the door staying open. It's not a punishment, it's just the price. And if I don't accept your terms? Then the door closes, Desmond said. And that's your choice, not ours. We're not slamming it. We're just not going to keep holding it open while you decide whether we're worth walking through. She smiled then, and it was thinner than her wedding smile. And she said something about ingratitude and about how she'd built a life we couldn't imagine. And Desmond put down his cup and stood up. He took a key off his ring, the key to that house, the house he'd grown up in, and he set it on the coffee table next to the untouched cream. Keep the room set for me if you want, he said. I'm not coming to sit in it. And we left. She didn't stop us. There was, for once, no audience for her to perform to, and I've noticed that people who only ever speak to a crowd don't always know what to say to an empty room. The consequences, when they came, didn't come from us. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to me. We didn't call anyone. We didn't tell her story around town. I never posted a word. But the room had been full of people, and people talk, and worse than talk, people simply withdraw. Over the following weeks, the League, the thing Beatrice had built her whole self around, the presidency she'd held for 11 years, quietly moved on without her. A vote at a meeting she didn't attend, a new name at the top of the newsletter. Nobody ran her out, they just stopped saving her a seat. The photographs of Beatrice with the enormous scissors came down off the League's website, one by one, replaced by someone else with newer scissors. Poppy Ashworth's family, it turned out, was one of the first to step back. The very patronage Beatrice had tried to marry her son into, gone, not because I did anything, but because you cannot be a patron of a woman whose party you walked out of. I didn't feel triumphant about any of it. I felt something closer to sober. This is what her life had been made of the whole time. Agreement. And when the agreement stopped, there was so little left. The strangest part was small and human, and happened in a grocery store. I was buying eggs, of all things, when a woman I recognized from the wedding, one of Beatrice's circle, one of the ones who had laughed, stopped her cart when she saw me. For a second I braced. Then she said quietly, I've been meaning to say, what she did was wrong. I should have said something in the moment, and I didn't, and I'm sorry I didn't. She didn't wait for me to absolve her. She just needed to say it, the way people need to set down a thing they've been carrying. She wheeled her cart away, and I stood there with a carton of eggs and understood that this was the actual shape of it. Not a courtroom, not a scandal, just person after person quietly deciding, in grocery stores and parking lots, that they didn't want to have laughed. That's a heavier verdict than any I could have delivered. It came from everywhere, and I never had to lift a finger for it. Desmond, meanwhile, Did the thing I have come to love him most for. He didn't just make a stand at a wedding and call it done. He kept choosing, in small, unglamorous ways, every week. He started driving down to Jacksonville on his days off. He reconnected with Caleb slowly, patiently, the two of them rebuilding 4 lost years, one bad joke at a time. And one afternoon he came home with a form from the base, a routine thing, the paperwork where you list who they call if something happens to you. He'd filled in my parents' names, Vincent and Clara Miller. "You can put anyone," I said. "It doesn't have to be." "They're the ones who'd come," he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "If it were the middle of the night and it was bad, they're the ones who'd get in the truck, so they're the ones I'm putting down." That was the week Gerald first appeared at the diner. I looked up from the register one afternoon and he was standing in the doorway, Desmond's father, in his good coat, not coming in and not leaving, like a man at the edge of water he isn't sure he's allowed to enter. My father saw him too. Neither of them said anything that day. Gerald just looked at the room for a while, the long table, the wall of photographs, and then he nodded, once, to no one in particular, and left. But I understood something had shifted. He came back. Then it was Sunday, and we drove to the diner for whatever it was Caleb needed to tell us. The diner was closed to the public, the way it is on Sundays. My mother had cooked too much, the way she always does. Caleb was already there when we came in, at the long table by the window, and I noticed it the second we walked in. The chair beside him, the chair that had been empty and set for 4 years, had a plate in front of it that was being used. He wasn't sitting in the kept chair anymore. He was sitting in it as a man who lived here. He waited until we'd eaten. Then he pushed his plate back and folded his hands and looked at me. "I need to tell you both something, and I need you to not be angry with your folks when I'm done." He glanced at my parents. My mother had gone still at the stove. My father set down his coffee. "Because they only kept quiet because I asked them to." I didn't understand yet. Desmond's hand found mine under the table. "In January," Caleb said, "you showed me a picture." He looked at me. "You were so proud of it. You called me up to tell me you'd set the date, and you sent me a photo of the two of you. And I looked at that photo, Matilda, and I knew the man in it." The room went very quiet. Only the sound of the coffee maker. "It was Brick's photo," he said, and his voice caught. "I mean, it was Desmond. It was the man I stayed on the wing for. The man I spent 3 years telling myself I'd lost." He shook his head slowly, like he still couldn't get his arms all the way around it. "The woman who taught me to walk again was marrying the man I'd walked into a fire for, and neither of you had any idea." I turned to my parents. My mother had a hand pressed flat against her chest. My father was looking at the table. "You knew," I said to them, "at the wedding. That's why you were so calm." "I told them," Caleb said, before they could answer. "I called your dad the same night I put it together. I told him who Desmond was to me, and I asked him, I begged him honestly, to keep it quiet, because it wasn't mine to blow up. It was your wedding. It was your day. And a man deserves to be found by his own life, not ambushed by mine at the altar." He looked at Desmond. "I figured I'd come to the wedding, sit in the back, and find you afterward, when it was quiet. Reintroduce myself over a beer, not in front of 200 people. I never planned to stand up. I only stood up because your mother put her hands on your wife." Desmond's voice, when it came, was rough. "I spent 3 years thinking I was the guy who let you disappear, that I got saved and couldn't even hold on to the man who saved me." "You didn't let me disappear," Caleb said. "I disappeared, on purpose. I was so far down after all of it, my family, the leg, that I couldn't stand the thought of you seeing me like that. The guy you flew with could fly. I didn't want to be the before picture in your head, so I cut the cord. That's mine, not yours." He looked at his hands. "And then a diner took me in, and a nurse taught me to walk, and somewhere in there, I stopped being the before picture even to myself. By the time I was worth calling again, I'd let too much time pass to know how to do it. And then you asked her to marry you, and she called me to tell me, and there the two of you were in a photograph." He almost smiled. "The universe has a sense of humor. It gave me back to you through her." "You were the one who was the wall," Desmond said, and his eyes were wet. "Not me. Never me." "Nah," Caleb said softly. "That was always both of us." I found out later exactly what that had cost my parents. 3 months. For 3 months they had known that their daughter was marrying the man their adopted son had saved, and they had said nothing. And they had let me have my ordinary, happy, unsuspecting engagement. Because Caleb asked them to, and because they understood something I was only starting to learn. That love is very often the thing you don't say, the secret you carry, so someone else gets to be happy in the dark a little longer. You could have told me, I said to my mother. Yes, she said. And it would have been about him, and about Desmond, and about the past. And I wanted one season where it was just about you. She wiped her hands on her apron, which is what she does when she doesn't want you to see them shaking. Let me have that. I gave you away once. I'm allowed to have wanted the day to be yours. Desmond stood up. He walked around the table to Caleb, and Caleb pushed himself up on the table the way he had at the wedding, and the two of them held on to each other for a long time, and I looked away, because some things you don't watch. When it was over, my mother did the thing that ended it. She pulled out the chair next to mine, an ordinary chair, nothing special about it, and she set a place in front of it, fork on the left, knife on the right, glass turned up, and she looked at Desmond. Sit here, she said. It's yours now. We don't take it back. He sat down. My husband, who had grown up in a house where his place at the table depended on his behavior, sat down in a chair that would be his whether he earned it or not, for the rest of his life, and I watched him understand what that meant. He had lost one family's table and been given another's, and the second one, it turned out, was the kind that doesn't get taken away. The chair that had been kept empty for years was full, and there was a new place set, for him. I looked around that table. My parents, my husband, the man my family had caught when his own family dropped him, and I finally understood the thing my mother had been trying to teach me my whole life with a fork and an empty chair. She wasn't keeping a seat for a person. She was keeping a promise about the kind of family we were going to be. A family with no far end of the table. A family where your place didn't rise and fall with how useful or impressive or convenient you were. Beatrice had spent a year trying to teach me that belonging is earned, that it can be granted and revoked, that some people sit close and some people sit by the kitchen doors. And here, at a diner off Lejeune Boulevard, was the whole rebuttal, set with a fork on the left and a glass turned up. I told you at the beginning that to understand the man who stood up, you had to understand a chair. Now you understand both. The wedding was in April. It's May now, an ordinary Sunday, and I want to tell you how it ends, because it ends small, the way the real things do. We were at the diner, all of us, when Gerald came in. He'd been coming for a few weeks by then, first standing in the doorway, then sitting at the counter with a coffee, then, gradually, closer. This time he came all the way in, and he stopped a few feet from the long table, and he was holding his hat in his hands like a man who wasn't sure of his welcome. I don't expect a place, he said. My father got up. He went to the wall, took down an extra chair, carried it over, and set it at the table. He pulled it out. In this diner, he said, you don't have to earn one. Gerald sat down. He didn't say much. He's not a man who says much. I think he spent 40 years married to someone who did all the saying. But he came back the next Sunday, and the one after. He never asked us to choose between him and Beatrice, and we never asked him to choose either. He just started showing up at the table where showing up was the only thing that was ever required. He told me one thing once, weeks in, over a slice of my mother's pie. He said, I watched her do it for 40 years. To other people, to me. I always told myself it wasn't my business to stop her. He turned his fork over. Turns out it was. I just didn't have the nerve until I watched her do it to you, at my own son's wedding. And I looked around that room, and I couldn't find one person who thought she was right. Not one. He didn't ask me to forgive him for the 40 years of silence. He just kept coming to the table, which is its own kind of apology, the kind that shows up instead of explaining. I don't know what happens to Beatrice from here. Last I heard, she still has the house and the pearls and the portrait of the grandfather, and far fewer people to show them to. The league moved on. The galas go on without her. I don't take pleasure in that. I've thought about whether I should, and I've decided I don't. She didn't lose anything I took from her. She lost the audience she'd mistaken for a life, and she lost it because 200 people saw who she was in the length of one slap and quietly decided they'd rather be somewhere else. Maybe someday she'll knock on the diner door. My father will pull out a chair if she does. That's the maddening, beautiful thing about people like my parents. The price of admission is only ever that you're willing to sit down as an equal. Beatrice may never be able to pay it. That's hers to work out, not mine. I don't know if Beatrice will ever come to that table. I've stopped needing her to. Some people learn, and some people just get quieter. And it isn't my job to know in advance which one she'll be. My coin is on the wall now. Caleb's coin, the squadron's coin, the one that lived in my scrub pocket and then in the hem of my wedding dress. My mother framed it, small and plain, and hung it on the wall of Sunday photographs. And nobody who comes into the diner knows what it is or what it cost. And that's fine. We know. I used to think Beatrice was talking about geography when she told me not to forget where I came from. I did forget, for a while. I forgot on purpose because I was ashamed of Greece and old coffee and a father who won't argue and a mother who cooks too much. It took a woman slapping me at my own wedding to remind me. Station, it turns out, isn't where you're seated. It's who pulls out a chair when you fall. The chair at our table isn't empty anymore. But my mother still cooks too much, and there's still an extra plate at the end most Sundays, set and waiting. Just in case, she says when I ask her who it's for. There's always room. So here's what I'll leave you with, and I'd honestly like to know what you think. I drew a hard line with a woman who is, whatever else she is, my husband's mother. I never took revenge. I never made her suffer. I just closed a door and let her decide whether to knock. Some of you will think that was right. Some of you will think it was cold, that family is family, that I should have kept trying. Tell me, would you have kept the door open? Or would you have set the price the way I did and let her choose? I know where I came from now. It's a diner off Lejeune Boulevard, and a long table by the window, and a chair nobody's allowed to take away. There's always room, but you have to know how to sit in it.